Economic, Social and Cultural Council, ECOSOCC, here to speak to us about efforts to instill African peace and security architecture, which is among the frameworks that control security and peace in the African continent. William, many thanks for joining us here on the New Dawn this morning. Speak to us a little bit more, first of all, about the role of ECOSOCC at the African Union.
Thank you very much, Michelle. The African Union established an organ known as the African Union Economic, Social and Cultural Council, which came into existence on 4th of July 2004. It was established under Article 5 and 22 of the African Union Constitutive Act in order to promote popular participation. This organ is basically an advisory, a technical advisory organ that provides input into the policies and programs and processes of the African Union. And at the same time, it represents citizens in terms of citizens' perspectives, citizens' input into policy decision-making at the highest level. That is the Assembly of Heads of States level. So ECOSOCC is an advisory organ, and it has a major role in popularizing AU programs and policy, ensuring that you bring the African Union closer to the people and the people closer to the African Union, so that they are able to contribute into development trajectory in the continent and contribute to integration and development of the continent as a whole.
All right. And of course, when you talk about issues of peace and security, in this technological age, there's a lot to discuss, terror threats and even just conflicts within societies and communities themselves. Now, ECOSOCC itself will be holding a colloquium on international peace and security in Nairobi. What will this colloquium be about?
Basically, as you're aware, the UN is organizing the UN Civil Society Conference here in Nairobi on the 9th and 10th with a team shaping a future for global and sustainable progress. And this is actually feeding into the broader conversation of the Summit of the Future. The Summit of the Future is basically looking at the reform of the UN, but more fundamentally looking at how we can keep track of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and ensure that there is fair, equitable, and a kind of a balanced multilateral system where every party will also have a voice. And therefore, ECOSOCC being an organ that represents citizens within the African framework, we thought it necessary to organize an off-site event that can provide input into the broader conversation on the aspect of the thematic focus on international peace, but basically looking at international cooperation. So the colloquium will basically look at, one, we're able to highlight the significant contribution of the African peace and security architecture, which is an architecture that has been established by the African Union. Secondly, we also want to use this platform to engage media, the journalists, and other stakeholders to look at how we can promote accurate reporting on peace, security, and stability-related issues. And then lastly, we also want to ensure that we have an outcome document with insights and perspectives and input of citizens that we can provide into the broader conversation on the international cooperation. So basically, this colloquium will have various stakeholders, what I will refer to as a multi-stakeholder kind of a discussion, where we will look at the contribution of the African citizens in relation to implementation of interventions and programs on peace and security-related issues in the continent.
All right. Even before we get to the role of even the media in accurate reporting to foster peace, you know, not to quell tensions or fuel tensions, what would you say is the space of the civil society in the African continent today? Prior
to 2000, the AU has a much more ad hoc kind of a working relationship with civil society. But predominantly, there were decisions and charter that recognize the participation and involvement of civil society, such as the declaration of the socio-economic political situation in Africa in the 1990s, the Charter on the Popular Participation in Development and Transformation in 1991, and then also the treaty on the establishment of the African Economic Communities. These were all conversations in terms of how you ensure citizens actively involve and participate in programs and policies of the then OAU. Run down to the year 2000 when the AU adopted the Constitutive Act of the African Union. There is a provision for civil society engagement, for civil society involvement and civil society participation under Article 5 and 22 that promote popular participation and the active involvement of civil society. And in that Constitutive Act, the AU made provision for the establishment of the African Union Economic, Social and Cultural Council, which is ECOSOCC, as an advisory body. Therefore, the AU being a people-centered and a people-driven union, the role of citizen is very fundamental in decision-making processes, but more importantly, in development processes that pertains to the development of citizens themselves. And therefore, citizens have been actively involved through ECOSOCC as a bridge that provides interface between citizens on one hand and government on the other hand in providing input into policies, into programs that affect citizens, but more fundamentally looking at the broader development scope on how citizens want to see the continent move forward.
Right, and even as you mentioned that, because there has been points of conflict across the African continent, and when you take a look at humanitarian reports, you find that the space of civil society and even the media shrinks a lot more in the event of conflict, in the event of elections, in the event of post-election violence. In Kenya, for example, you know, we had mass demonstrations, and the space of the media shrunk drastically, the space of civil society as well. Would you say that African governments are more open to working with civil society now?
Well, it's a very dicey kind of a question in terms of response. I think there's a lot more in terms of awareness. There's a lot more in terms of the avenues for engagement. Whether the willingness is there, whether the openness is there, is another question to answer. But in terms of the avenues, the opportunity for engagement, I think civil society and the media, and because of the digital media also, there's a whole lot of awareness, and therefore citizens are engaging, citizens are criticizing, citizens are demanding for accountability, because we have a fundamental role to play. Our role is to demand for accountability. Our role is to ensure that development is at a, you're able to, the commitment that you have made as a government, you're able to provide and meet those commitments in the best interest of citizens. Therefore, I think there is an avenue for engagement. And this is a relationship that will continue to enhance and improve as we continue to embark on this journey in terms of bringing citizens at the forefront of development within the African Union space. But when you look at ECOSOCC, it is a vehicle that is established in order for you to be able to channel your perspectives, your concerns, and issues which are fundamental to citizens, especially at the level of influencing policy. Therefore, our organ is responsible to provide input into policy decision-making of the African Union.
Right. And so this colloquium, which will be happening on the 8th of May on international peace and security, will, among others, hold critical talks on the African peace and security architecture, which you mentioned. And this is a framework for promoting peace, security and stability in Africa. What is the role of this framework, APSA, as it's called, within the broader perspective of international cooperation?
Yeah, the African Union established the African Peace and Security Architecture as an architecture that promotes peace, security, and stability in the continent. So one of the main organs that the architecture works with is the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. But when you look at the comprehensive nature of its intervention, it's look at various programs. One, it's look at early warning and conflict prevention. So there are many programs related to early warning and conflict prevention that is being developed by the African Union, various organs and departments that we implement in various member states of the African Union. Secondly, there is the aspect of peace building, peacemaking, and post-conflict reconstruction and development issues. These are all engagement within the APSA framework itself. And there is also the aspect of humanitarian aid and humanitarian response to disaster within the APSA framework. But more fundamentally, There is also the aspect of promotion of democratic principles, respect for human rights and social justice.
Right.
So this framework creates a comprehensive agenda for engagement with African government, with citizens, to ensure that we promote peace, security, and stability. Like you rightly said, we are confronted with numerous challenges. There are a new dynamic trend. We're looking at terrorism and violent extremism, transnational crime, issues of unconstitutional changes of government. These are all threats to our democracy, and therefore peace and security become a major concern. So for the African Union, the APSA is a fundamental cornerstone that actually establishes the commitment of the African Union in promoting peace, security, and stability in the continent.
Right, and of course, it's a very comprehensive agenda for peace and security on the continent. And among the issues that it focuses on, like you mentioned, is early warning and conflict prevention. Now, of course, the role of civil society is very important when it comes to especially conflict areas, because they get to document, they get to point out human rights violations. But when you talk about the space of the media, and in many situations the media has had to work in conflict situations and can play an important role in conflict resolution, and people do not have access to neutral and independent information, there's a lot of manipulation that can happen. How does the role of the media, especially in conflict situations, work in tandem with the civil society?
I mean, accurate reporting is very fundamental in any conflicting situation. And therefore, you need to have a media to be able to report accurately. Understanding the context is also very fundamental, especially in our own context. Many a times, conflicting situations are not reported by our own media practitioners. And therefore, these are information that can then be distorted out there. So understanding the context, having the media as part of the whole system is very important. So for instance, within the ECOSOCC system, the media are also part of the social sector of the African Union ECOSOCC when we talk about its composition. How do we organize training so that the media are well empowered in terms of having the right training so that you're able to report accurately on information that is happening in the context? How do you also work with civil society organization at the grassroots level in order to provide you with the relevant contextual reality of what the situation is on the ground? So media role is very fundamental, like you rightly said. And I think the independence of the media is also very important so that you are able to report reflective of what is happening on the ground without necessarily any bias or any compromise with any institution.
What barriers and challenges would you say are there in the civil society space that the African continent needs to get past?
I think in terms of transparency and accountability, where civil society demand for accountability, most of the time they have been seen as opposition to government. But then at the same time, for those of us who engage with civil society, we always say, try to have a fair perspective. When government is doing well, you can tap them on the back to say they are doing well there. But at the same time, when there is time for you to demand for accountability, you demand for accountability. By doing that, you create a balance and fair perspective in terms of your accountability role. But the other aspect is mostly related to policies. What are some of the laws you have in your countries that are actually and friendly policies? Are they restrictive policies? Are they liberal policies that actually create space for civil society for engagement, for civil society to also be able to demand for accountability? These are very important aspects that we need to interrogate. What are the kind of laws do we have at country level? But I think civil society have played fundamental role in our democratic processes, in our development processes, and they have been engaging in various frontiers. Right.
What would you say is the role then of civil society in advancing governance, not just locally, but globally? When you take a look at what's happening in Palestine and Gaza, and we've seen civil society organizations across the country stage demonstrations to call for peace in other parts of the country. What is the role then of civil society in advancing global governance?
I mean, civil society role, like I said, is very fundamental. One, you're talking about a representative group that actually represent the wider citizenry. And therefore, when you talk about their development, when you talk about peace and security, it's about them. It's about the citizen. And therefore, they need to be part of those decision-making processes. They need to be able to follow and ensure that there is accountability. They need to be able to ensure that promises that have been made by government, they're able to live up to the expectation of those promises. So citizens' role is very important. Therefore, when you look at civil society role across the globe, they have been playing more of a watchdog role. They have been playing an advocacy role. They have been playing accountability role. They have been playing all this kind of role to ensure that society has what it dues. Therefore, we want to create a much more constructive working relationship between government and civil society, where they see themselves as complementary partners, not necessarily opposition, where you cannot meet at a common ground. So this has been a major issue over the years with civil society engagement with government in a scenario where mostly they are seen as opposition to government. But fundamentally, when you create space for civil society to engage, to advocate, then the result is in the best interest of society as a whole.
APSA itself, the framework, which is basically AU's commitment to promoting peace and security in Africa, has been in place for 2 decades now.
Yeah.
What contributions would you say has it made in the continent?
I know most of the time when we talk about peace and security in the continent, people normally ask, where are we? But honestly, if you look at where we are coming from to where we are today, you will see significant progress has been made in terms of peace, security, and stability in the continent. That is one. Secondly, the ability that we have today in terms of engaging, in terms of having a conversation, sitting on the table to discuss some of these issues. They might be taking longer period, but we are discussing and we are getting to a point where we are getting results. So I think APSA, through the early warning, especially the early warning mechanism, where you're able to identify potential triggers in order to de-escalate conflict, has been one of the major success in many instances. Because most of the time when interventions are taken to address those issues, you don't announce or you don't talk about it. So most of the time, the early warning mechanism and early warning response has contributed significantly in addressing so many conflicting situations that could have escalated. So that is one major achievement within the African Union APSA framework. The second aspect in terms of conflict prevention, and more especially peace building and peace making and all those negotiations. I mean, Kenya has been one of the typical examples during the post-election violence. We saw the role of the late Kofi Annan in terms of mediating. These are all African Union initiatives in addressing peace. And we also have what we call preventive diplomacy. And preventive diplomacy is going in line with the early warning. When once there is a potential trigger that has been identified, then you're able to identify high-level envoy to engage with relevant stakeholders to see how you can de-escalate the issue. Right. So generally, APSA has been playing significant role in terms of addressing peace, security challenges in the continent.
Right. So of course, this even the colloquium on international peace and security comes on the sidelines, as you mentioned, of the UN Civil Society Conference, and the theme is shaping a future of global and sustainable progress. Talk to us about the importance of this theme, especially in line with the Zero Draft Pact for the Future.
So one of the thematic area too, which is looking at international peace, is very fundamental, because if we talk about development, we need to talk about peace, because there will be no development if there's no peace. And therefore, it is fundamental that we look at peace, security, and stability in the continent. We are looking at a global agenda. What has been the role of the African Union? What has been the role specifically of APSA in terms of its contribution into the global agenda? And that is the reason why this colloquium is going to basically look at how we get perspective, input, and insight from civil society organizations that are implementing programs on peace intervention at various constituency levels. And their intervention will come in the form of best practices, lessons learned, the challenges that they have encountered. They will provide it as an input. And the expectation of the colloquium, the outcome document should be able to provide input into the broader international cooperation conversation on the Summit of the Future. Remember, we are talking about the reform of the UN. We are talking about how we keep track of the sustainable development goals. And therefore, we want to see what is the contribution of the African civil society in the implementation of peace, security-related issues in the continent as a contribution into that global conversation.
Right. Even as ECOSOCC itself gives civil society organizations and basically just citizens of AU member states an active role in contributing to AU principles and policies and programs, there's been concerns that the African Union may not be felt on the ground, perhaps as it should be. In fact, some have called the African Union a toothless dog, so to speak. Would you say that the contribution of civil societies, allowing citizens to contribute to principles and policies, has changed governance within the AU member states? Does the AU follow up on implementation of these policies in these respective member states?
I think the concerns from citizens are legitimate concerns. And there are efforts by the African Union in establishing mechanism at country level so that you're able to have a proper interface in terms of what happened at the constituency level all the way to the regional and the continental level. And that is the reason why we have recently just adopted what we call the National Chapter Framework. The National Chapter Framework is basically a framework that is established at country level that one work on popularizing AU programs and policy, raise awareness on AU programs and policy, but also create space for citizens to be able to engage on issues and provide their input directly. And this input can be synthesized and provide as a policy recommendation to the African Union. In terms of whether these recommendations or policy advice are being implemented, to some extent, I would say significant part of our contribution have found themselves in some of our outcome documents, have found themselves in some of the policy that we are implementing at the continental level. Right. So I would say significant progress has been made, but we still have a long way to go. And I'm pretty sure with the continued engagement with citizens themselves to raise this awareness and perspective, I think we will get there.
All right, many thanks. That is William Carew, who is the head of Secretariat at the African Union Economic, Social and Cultural Council, which is holding a colloquium on international peace and security at the sidelines of the UN Civil Society Conference here in Nairobi. William, many thanks for speaking to us here on The New Dawn. Take a short break on the broadcast. We'll be back with much more.
Everybody has got to learn how to put in some effort and some energy in order to make their dreams come to pass. Manage your resources, especially in this day when we are all out there looking for money. You've got to learn how to synchronize your rhythm. The first thing that I will talk about is be clear about where you want to go. It is said, and it is nearly cliche, that leaders are readers. Rest is a state where you disconnect from things that exert or require your energy.
This is the biggest reggae and rhythm show ever.